right, thanking and praising God for the value in repetition, especially strategic repetition. Let's call Mark chapter 13, which heavily mirrors Matthew chapter 24. Let's keep the same title. Let's call it the ends, as the synoptic gospels are going to have a familiar pattern as Jesus enters Jerusalem in the triumphal entry. As I sum it up, it's typically going to have 3 chapters in each of the books of the synoptic gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. One devoted to his authority being established in the triumphal entry, then it being challenged in the next chapter, only to have him talk about the ultimate results of having having his authority from God challenged and undermined, that being the ends, 2 ends. One, the end of what seems to be Jerusalem, as we mentioned, AD 70, and then the end of all things, marked by the return of the Christ and his angels to collect those who are his, with Mark's description of those 2 ends roughly mirroring much of what we see in Matthew's description in Matthew 24, as we mentioned, but there's enough nuance that I picked up at least something I think is valuable. 2 themes that I did not pick up in going through Matthew's version of the end times. Understanding that in verses 1 and 2, it is once again going to be kicked off by the apostles, some of them admiring the buildings of the temple. This time it's noted as they sit from, the Mount of Olives? No, he tells them that as they are leaving the temple, not one stone will be left on another that will not be thrown down. Let me just read it. I misquoted that. There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. They ask for clarification from the Mount of Olives as they sit there for the signs of the end of the age. And I think they're also going to ask when these things are going to happen, understanding that after the first 2 verses where he notices that it's all going to be destroyed, he is then going to answer their question about the signs of the close of the age, going from verses 3 on through 13, broken up into 2 paragraphs in the ESV that effectively seem to sum up the signs of the end of the age in verses 3 through 8, and in verses 9 through 13, practical points of what that means for his apostles, specifically beginning the chapter or that part of his warnings to them, the way that the chapter is going to end. Literally saying in verse 8, but be on guard, as he goes on to tell them things that they need to know for their own ministries. Closing out the last section of the chapter in verse 33, saying likewise, be on guard, as 3 times he will tell them to be awake as they await his return. But going back in sequence, verses 3 through 7 are going to talk generally about the signs that he's going to describe as the beginning of the birth pains, not to have them become too alarmed at thinking that the birth pains are actually signs of the end. He is going to say, no, there's going to be additional tribulation, meaning they are going to be turned over to officials and tribunals and kings for his sake in a time that is going to be noted by its betrayal. And similar to the way in which the Christ was received, verse 13 is going to say, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And like we said in Matthew's description of the end times, that may be a general summation that now breaks down into a description of 2 distinct periods of end times, but it could simply be a break or a waypoint between him discussing the end of the first age, meaning the age of Israel, it would seem, because it clearly seems that there's a distinction between the tribulation and the return or the second coming. That's going to be marked by verse 24. So whether or not verse 13 marks a summation picked up by a greater description or more in-depth description of the tribulation that comes before Christ's return, either way, there are 2 clear endpoints that he's talking about. How do we know? Well, from verses 14 on through verse 23, he's going to talk about a period of time or an end time that is sparked or set off by the abomination of desolation as prophesied in Daniel. At least when Matthew describes it, he describes it as prophesied by the prophet Daniel. He is going to say that the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not be in verse 14 is going to be a sign that wherever you are, just run. Don't get anything else. Going on to talk about the way in which in verse 22, false Christs and false prophets will arise, but to be wary and not to follow them. And the reason why is he is then going to go into a description of what his second coming or his return is actually going to look like, going from verses 24 through 27 to seem to draw a distinction between the tribulation of those days and his second coming, saying, but in those days, after that tribulation, he'll go on to give the signs of his second coming, concluding in verse 27, where it's going to say, and then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Thus the second end that he seems like he is describing, as much like we saw in Matthew 24, he's going to sum it up by saying, just as you understand from the fig tree when it's putting out its leaf that summer is near, understand these signs of even more significant things, as he uses the fig tree illustration from verses 28 through 31, concluding the chapter in verses 32 through 37, as we mentioned, with a practical note for them, bookending what he's already told them, because in verse 33 he's going to say, what does all this essentially mean for you? Be on guard. Keep awake, something he's going to repeat in verse 35. Therefore, stay awake, as in the very last verse, 37, he is going to say, and what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. Understanding that those three warnings to stay awake are similar to what we saw in Matthew's practical warnings about the end times. Understand that there's a footnote that might have been in Matthew, but caught my attention actually in Mark's description here in chapter 13. It says in the first instance of stay awake, or the warning to stay awake, in verse 33, there is a footnote that says some manuscripts add and pray, which caught my attention because what did not catch my attention in Matthew's version or Matthew's description of the end times is in verse 18, where he says, pray that it may not take place in the winter. Understanding that, as I say it, I realize he probably did say that in Matthew as well, but the value in strategic repetition is, for those of us who don't get it all in the first go around, it gives us an opportunity, as we have mentioned in the past, to build on the foundation of what we actually retain from past lessons, and God willing, retain more. Helping me to understand something that God, I think, has begun to help me understand more as I get older, and that is, even in situations that seem etched in stone, it is important for us to be able to discern, with God's help, the wiggle room or the opportunity for grace, mercy, and movement, even within otherwise certain circumstances. And so here, as Jesus is prophesying about the end of the age, seeming the end of the age in Jerusalem, leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. But whatever age he's talking about then, he's distinguishing it from something that happens after the tribulation of those days, and that being his second coming. These two things are certain. What is not certain, as he's literally going to say, is the timing. And so it seems that if he is asking them to pray, it could be quite possibly like his prayer in the garden to have the cup pass from him. It may be so certain that there is no variation or variable within what's prophesied. But if he is telling them to pray, there may be variation in timing and opportunity even in those days, reminding me of the way that the end times in some ways reflect some of the things that we saw during the time of the Exodus. Understanding that even as God brought plagues that were going to bring the end of an era of captivity in Egypt, there was a Goshen that he carved out for his people, even as Egypt at large was being plagued. A place of relative peace for his people in the midst of the great tribulation that was plaguing Egypt around them. And even though Christ's prophecies of a future tribulation that may be similar to the Revelation's prophecies of a future tribulation that will in fact affect God's people, even though they might not carve out that degree of a Goshen or a peace for his people, the fact that he is telling his people to pray literally regarding the conditions of the end of an era in Israel, it would seem, and then quite possibly in some manuscripts going along with that warning to stay awake, also warning them to pray. He's quite possibly helping us to understand that part of staying awake effectively is praying for God to open doors of opportunity that might not otherwise be open during the days of tribulation to come.